If you have your Bibles, you can be turning over there with me. And the title of our lesson is Just a Pilgrim. And it's based upon a conversation that takes place in Genesis 47 between Jacob, very aged man at this time, and the young ruler Pharaoh over all of Egypt. And remember last week we studied how Jacob took all of his things and he began journeying into Egypt. He stops at Beersheba to make sure he's doing God's will. When he understands he is, then he takes everything that he has and he goes down into Egypt. And whenever Jacob and his family, the record tells us there's about 70 souls, 70 people that go down with him into Egypt. Whenever they get there, Joseph has to introduce them and kind of get them adapted, I guess, to the Egyptian culture in the area. And he wanted them to personally appear before Pharaoh in his court. And so that's what they do. They go into the court of Pharaoh and they meet him face to face, and the interaction between them is very favorable. Remember that if you've read ahead or you know the story, Pharaoh gives them the land of Goshen, a very rich land, a very prosperous land at that time. And they also receive the blessings of Pharaoh for dwelling in his land. And so Joseph has introduced his family to Pharaoh. He's kind of got them set up and ready, and they're established. Remember, they had a lot of flocks and herds that they bring along with them too, so that was part of adapting to this new environment and this new culture. And so he's worked out the living arrangements for his family. He's worked out the arrangements for the flocks of Jacob. And now he's eager to introduce his father to Pharaoh. And at this time, again, think about the age of Jacob and where he is in his life. And if you read the account here in Genesis 47, it's not really long. I think there's about 3 or 4 verses, verses 7 through 9 or 7 through 10, that deal with the conversation that takes place between Pharaoh and Jacob, or Israel. And it's very brief, not a lot of details that are given to us, but it's very interesting to me because think about again the setting. It's this very young man who is ruler over the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And he's talking to this elderly, aged father who's basically a refugee. I mean, he's fled to Egypt in order to survive, in order to prosper. And they're at very different points in their life. And so they have a brief conversation here, but it makes for a fascinating encounter to me. And so I want us to look at that conversation today. That's going to be the focus of our study. And I want to talk about this idea of just being a pilgrim. And if you're not familiar, the way that the word is translated, pilgrim in the King James Version, it's not really the very same way that we use the word today. But it carries this idea that you're a foreigner or a stranger. You don't live there. And so if somebody comes to Jacob and they were to ask him, where do you live? He would say, well, heaven is my home. And in his mind, that's what he's doing as he's going through life. He's making this journey toward his home. He's not staying here upon this earth. That's not his purpose. But he's journeying toward his home. It's a long journey. It takes a lot of time. And there's a lot of effort that's involved with it too, a long ways to get there. And if some of these principles sound familiar, I was putting this lesson together and I was thinking, man, it seems like I preached this before. Sometimes as a preacher you have a deja vu and you think, have I already preached this? Do I need to rework this? But I was looking back in my notes, and remember we had a series on faith. And there was one of the lessons that we studied, it was done back in May of last year, but it was faith in our home. And so it's kind of revolving around this same principle, the idea of being a pilgrim here upon this earth. The idea that this is not our home. We're just on a temporary journey. We're just passing through, but we're headed to our home. And that place is heaven. And so the first point that I want us to dwell about and think about, again, if you're taking notes, I'll try to lay it out as easily as I can. But point number 1 is the mentality that a pilgrim develops. The idea, the mentality that we develop as we live life here upon this earth. And so if you look in verse 7 there of Genesis 47, it says, Joseph brought in Jacob his father, and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, How old art thou? And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Now notice how he describes his life here upon this earth. First of all, he gives the exact number of years that he's been living, but he says, this is just my pilgrimage. In other words, this isn't where I'm planning to live. This isn't where I'm planning to stay. This is just part of my journey, a temporary stop, and I've stopped here for 130 years. Well, we think about that and we say, that's an awful long ways or a long time to stop in one place, right? But in view of eternity, it isn't. And so Jacob's concept is, my life here upon this earth is just a small portion of my journey. And it's interesting, I don't know if Pharaoh had ever seen a man as old as Jacob before. The very first words that are out of his mouth, and generally if you're meeting somebody and you think about, well, what am I going to say to him first? It isn't, man, how old are you? That's kind of the impression that I get where when Pharaoh and Jacob meet, though, Pharaoh says, how many years old are you? And Jacob says, well, I'm 130 years old, but this is just my pilgrimage. I'm just sojourning here. I'm stopping for a while. And you think about the biblical perspective of how God wants us to think about living our lives here upon the earth, and that's it, isn't it? It's not this idea of we're going to be here forever. It's not this idea of making this our permanent home, but this is just a small stop in the greater journey of life. And so we're going to stay here for a while, yeah, but we're moving on after we go from here. And when we have that pilgrimage approach to life, it gives us a very unique perspective on life. And so if you're taking notes, subpoint here under the idea of the mentality of Pilgrim develops, the first one is earthly life is just a visit. That's all it is. Go back to Hebrews chapter 11. I mentioned a year ago I did a series of lessons on that chapter. But I want you to think about the mindset, the pilgrimage mindset that these great men and women of faith had, because that's what it takes to be pleasing to God. That's what it takes to live an acceptable life here upon this earth. But in verse 13, it says this about these men and women. It says, These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. What was their mentality about life here upon this earth? It wasn't permanent. It wasn't the greatest step in their journey of life. It wasn't the best that they had to experience. They were just strangers and pilgrims while they were living here upon this earth. And verse 13 says, These all had that same mindset. And if you go back and you retrace the steps of the Hebrew writer in Hebrews 11, these all are men like Enoch, and men like Noah. And then you have Sarah, a great woman of faith. And then you have Abraham. And then you have Isaac and Jacob. All those people that he's mentioned before. Their mindset while living here upon this earth is, earthly life is just a visit. We're not going to stay here forever. There's a lot of different metaphors that people have used to describe life. Some will describe it as a battle. Some might use the metaphor of a race to describe it. We might even think of a puzzle or an enigma, some people, when they think about life. But the metaphor that we as Christians should have for life is the idea of a pilgrim or a pilgrimage. And so when we have that, it gives us a unique approach to the way that we live life here upon this earth. And that's what those great men and women of faith like Enoch and Noah and Sarah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob had, this pilgrimage concept. If you look in verse 16 of Hebrews chapter 11, it says, But now they desire a better country, that is a heavenly, wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. It's not that they didn't know they were going to spend time here upon this earth. It was just the way that they felt about their time upon earth and the way that they viewed it. And so this was, to them, the earthly life was just a small part of their eternal life. This was the beginning of life for them. It's a short stop. we all know this. Our time here upon this earth is brief. I mean, even if we live to be a great, a number of years old, if we live to be 100 years old, most people would probably look at that and say, that's a long time. But in view of eternity, it is not, is it? It's just a brief stop, a brief time, a temporary period that we have to live here upon this earth. And what we're really looking for and looking forward to, just like Abraham, is a heavenly home. That's what we're aiming for, and that's where we're journeying. And so life here on earth has to be seen in the greater context of eternity. That's appropriate as Christians, and that's necessary in order to be pleasing to God. And so the mentality of a pilgrim that develops is, number one, earthly life is just a visit. Number two, the eternal is what's important, not the temporal. And there are different ways that the Bible emphasizes these things to us. If we look at this life and we say, well, this is just temporary. We're not going to live here. This is not our home. We're not going to stay here forever. Then it causes you to view things a little bit differently, doesn't it? It causes you to put less value on the place where you're stopping than the place where you're going. And so Peter wrote in 1 Peter 2 and beginning in verse 11, he says, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation." Peter's concern for first century Christians was the way that outsiders felt and thought whenever they viewed the life of a Christian. And he wanted the outsiders, he wanted the unbelievers, the non-Christians, to be able to look at the way a Christian lived and say and understand and see a difference, a notable difference in the value that they placed upon things here upon this earth. And so there's a couple things that he talks about there in that verse. In verse 11, he talks about abstaining from fleshly temptations. A lot of people live their life like these temptations of the flesh are the greatest thing that could ever happen to a person. But as Christians, we understand that the flesh, the physical world, is not all there's going to be to life. Our life goes far beyond just this world and the things that we find here upon it. And so in verse 11, he talks about abstaining from fleshly lust. In verse 12, he's talking about the way that we live, having our conversation honest among the Gentiles. How are we living here upon this earth? Are we trying to deceive people? Are we trying to manipulate people? Are we trying to hide the type of person that we really are and the life that we're living here upon this earth? That's not the way that a Christian should be. A Christian should live their lives like an open book. And so Peter's hope was when these unbelievers, these non-Christians looked at Christians and their view that they had on life, it caused them to change their conduct. And his hope was that they would see a difference in their conduct. They would actually see the good that came from the way that they lived their lives here upon this earth. Jesus helped us put matters in perspective when he told his disciples in Matthew 6:19 through 20, he said, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal." What was Jesus doing? He was reminding us. We need to always be reminded of this fact that the things of this earth are superficial. The things of this earth are temporary in nature. The things that are of heaven, the spiritual matters, are things of eternity. That's what the rest of our life is going to consist of. And so if we put all of our value in this life and the things that it has to offer here upon this earth, we're going to be sorely disappointed in the next, aren't we? But if we put our value on the things that are coming next, on the things that are going to last, on the things that are important, then that's going to help us live the type of life that God wants us to here upon this earth. And so it's this mindset, it's this mentality that we should have, that we should think about life as a pilgrimage. And you see that reflected in the language of Jacob. When we think about life an earthly life, we should just think about it as being temporary. When we think about earthly death, we should only think about it as being a temporary thing in nature. When we think about our possessions, we should only think about, well, I'm not going to have these things forever. When we think about our relationships, sometimes things that we emphasize a lot in our world, these are not permanent relationships, all the physical relationships that we have in life. The spiritual ones, those are the ones that are going to last. Those are the things that are eternal. Those are the things that are important. And so when earthly things become permanent in our minds, then basically all that's going to matter to us is the here and now. And when you look at the world, that's really the mindset they have, is these things to them are permanent. But the reality of it is they're not going to last forever. And so if we understand that, it's going to have a different effect on the way that we live life. You know, the things here upon this earth are not going to be as important to us as the eternal things. And so Jesus emphasized that. So you have the mindset that a pilgrim develops. The second point that we want to talk about is the difficulty that a pilgrim encounters. And one of the first things that stands out to me is again, the way that Jacob describes his life. In verse 9, well, he says in the first part of the verse, he says, you know, I've lived 130 years. But, he said, I haven't lived as long as my fathers have. And he says in verse 9, how does he think about his life? He says, few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. Well, that's an interesting way to think about life, isn't it? But again, 130 years in a lot of people's eyes would have been a long life. Isaac, his father, lived to be 180. Abraham, his grandfather, lived to be 175. He said, I've lived a long time, but I haven't lived as long as my father and my grandfather lived here upon this earth. But yet I've lived long enough that the days that have been here have been evil. So, when you think about the two ways he describes it, number one, few. And again, that's the eternity concept, you know, looking at your life here upon this earth from a greater perspective. It doesn't matter how long you live. I mean, Methuselah, what? He lived 969 years. That's a few days in view of eternity, though. It's not a long time. And so, regardless of how many years that we live here, it's going to be few. But he also says they've been evil. And what does he mean by that? Well, he doesn't mean that he's lived a wicked life. You know, he doesn't mean that he's been disregarding God's commandments out here and doing things that he shouldn't have been doing, just living a sinful and a wicked and an evil lifestyle. But what it is talking about is the idea of distress or misery, or we might even say calamity. And when you stop and you think about the life of Jacob, I think he was thinking about the many tragedies that he had experienced in this life. I was just reflecting back on some of the things that Jacob's life involved, some of the tragedies, some of the misfortunes, some of the calamities that came along. Some of them were self-inflicted, I'll give you that, but some of them were just the course of life too. But we read in Genesis 27 and verse 41 that Esau, remember Esau is his brother, he hated Jacob. And remember what he said? He said, I will kill my brother. Well, how would you like to experience that in life? I've said a couple weeks ago, I think we've all probably had disagreements with family members, but I've never had a family member say, well, I'm going to kill you. You know, that would be a difficult thing to have to deal with. Remember when he runs away from Esau, he goes to his uncle Laban's, and he works for Laban for at least 14 years. And you remember what he says as he's leaving? He turns to Rachel in Genesis 31 and verse 7, and he says, your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. How'd you like your time there with Laban, Jacob? I didn't like it at all. You know, he's constantly trying to take advantage of it. He's constantly trying to deceive me. Remember, as he grows older, we might think, well, his life is settling down. You know, he reconciles with Esau. He's now a very blessed and prosperous man. And then in Genesis 42 and verse 36, he loses Joseph. And then later on, when he sends his sons into the land of Egypt, he loses Simeon. And so you have all these tragedies that have befallen him, and now you get into Genesis 47, and if you look at verse 13, it says, there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore. Think about what he's saying here. Pharaoh says, how old are you? He says, I'm 130 years old. I can just see in the mind of Pharaoh, 130. Man, you've had a good life, haven't you? Jacob says, no, I have not had a good life. My life has been filled with misery. My life has been filled with distress and calamity. And again, if you think about life, that's not to minimize life here upon this earth. But friends, the longer I live, the more distress and calamity and misery that I see, the more I understand it's not the greatest of lives, is it? There's things that come along with it that are hard to bear. And so we don't have to, when we look at this life, we don't have to look at it as if this is all there is. As if this is the best of living that we'll ever experience. The reality of it is this is the worst of living if we're Christians. This is the worst of living, this life that we're ever going to experience. It only gets better from here. It only goes up. And so Jacob says, no, it hasn't been a great life. There's been a lot of evil, a lot of misery, a lot of distress and calamity that I've had to experience. Now again, you look at Jacob's life, some of that was self-inflicted. And I'd say probably if we all looked at our life, we could say that's true too. Some of the misery and calamity that comes to us is self-inflicted. But others was not. I mean, the famine, the greatest famine, was not his fault. It's just a product of living in a physical world. And sometimes when you live in a society that is filled with people who have a wicked mindset, there are tragic things that happen because of it. And so it's just the life of a pilgrim. We have to understand that there are some things that we're going to encounter in this life that are just simply beyond our control. The second point under this heading, and I already mentioned it, but I want to emphasize it, this is not the best part of living. Paul said something about that in 1 Corinthians 15, didn't he? You remember in verse 19 he said, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. Is this life here upon this earth all that a pilgrim has to look forward to? Absolutely not. Is this life here upon this earth the best life that can be lived, that can be offered to a person who is a pilgrim? No. Paul said, if that's the case, if this is the only hope that we have, this life that we're living here upon this earth, he said people should pity us more than any other people that are living on the face of the earth. We're a sorry lot of people, aren't we? If this is the best that life has to offer us. The good news is it gets better. Think about the life of the Egyptians and think about how hard it was during this time. And again, it's reflected throughout Genesis 47. Remember, we read in verse 13, this famine is very sore upon the land. And so what happens? The storehouses of Egypt are opened up. The only problem is this: if you want something to eat, you got to have money, right? And so you read in verse 15, the first year they spent all their money. They took all their money just to survive, to buy the food that they needed in order to survive. So when you go down to verse 18, it says, when that year was ended, they came unto him the second year and said unto him, we will not hide it from my Lord, how that our money is spent. My Lord also hath our herds of cattle. There is aught left in the sight of my Lord, but our bodies and our lands. Think about how hard a life they lived. The first year they ran out of money. The second year they brought, we got livestock, right? We have possessions, so they bring all their possessions and they're trading it for food. And eventually they got down to their homes and their land and they said, that's all we've got. You know, we want to survive here. We need food, so we'll trade that in. And you know what happens by the end? The only way that they can survive is to sell themselves into slavery. In other words, we'll sell our bodies. We'll become the servants, the slaves of Pharaoh. So think about Pharaoh in this position. Pharaoh owns everything. I mean, he's got all this land that belongs to him. He's got all these animals that belong to him. He's got all the money in Egypt. All the people belong to him. And so Pharaoh kind of redistributes them wherever he wants. He says, you guys are going to live over here and you're going to live over here. And now because you're my servants, you're going to plant fields for me. Now, he was gracious or You might say Joseph was, however you want to view it, because he did give, he divided it into fifths. A fifth of whatever profit was brought was given to Pharaoh. 4/5 were given back to the people. Whatever they raised, they got to keep. But I want you to think about that lifestyle. Was their life here upon this earth great? I mean, almost everybody ended up losing everything. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any possessions. They didn't own any land. They didn't even have the freedom to go do whatever they wanted to do because they had sold themselves, their own bodies and their family, into the service of Pharaoh. And that wasn't to get rich. You know, some people might say, well, I'd do that if that means in the end, you know, I'll come out on top. That was just to survive. That's what they did. Do you think, how many of us, if we had a life like that, would look at that and say, well, I've had a good life, you know? This earth is not the best life. That's the point. And so if we're expecting everything here upon this earth to be the best, and for this experience that we have here to be the best experience that we'll ever have throughout all of eternity, we're kidding ourselves. Because that's not what this life is about. The idea of pilgrim mentality, what it does is it helps us prepare for the difficulties that we're going to encounter in this life. And so the thought is, this is not the best that God has to offer. The best is yet to come. The third point that I want to emphasize in this conversation between Pharaoh and Jacob is the qualities that a pilgrim displays. And notice in verse 7, it says, and Joseph brought in Jacob his father and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Did you catch that? Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Now, you go down to verse 10, after they're getting ready to depart, he repeats the process at the end. It says, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. And what I want to emphasize to you is that a pilgrim, one of the qualities that a pilgrim displays is they have the correct view of people. Here you have this idea of Pharaoh, who is a world leader. I mean, he's the most powerful man on the face of the earth at this point in this time. And here's Jacob, and Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Now, how could an elderly old man, you know, who's a refugee, bless the most powerful man on the face of the earth? You remember the Hebrew writer when he was using the idea of the law of Moses versus the law of Christ, and how the law of Moses is an inferior system. He brought up a priest by the name of Melchizedek. He talks about how Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And he says this in Hebrews 7 and verse 7. He says, without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. In other words, the inferior is blessed by the superior. If you're the inferior person, you have nothing to offer. You can't bless somebody who's superior to you. And so the way that it works is the superior has to bless the inferior. So I want you to think about Jacob blessing Pharaoh. Now, in the eyes of the world, you know, I don't know what Pharaoh was expecting whenever Jacob comes before him. He probably, I mean, just common sense would tell me that he probably expected Jacob to be overwhelmed. You know, here you are, you're appearing before the most powerful person on the face of the earth. How are most people going to feel? They're going to feel intimidated, aren't they? They're going to feel like they don't belong in this place. If that was the way that Pharaoh expected Jacob to feel, he must have been sorely disappointed, because Jacob was definitely underwhelmed, wasn't he? And so as he goes before Pharaoh, the greatest king on the face of the earth, he is blessing him. In the eyes of the world, if the world were to view these two men, Pharaoh would have been more important in their eyes than Jacob. But if you view him from God's perspective, do you know who the superior person was? It was Jacob, wasn't it? And that's what Jacob understood as he lived his life here upon this earth. It's not about position. It's not about power. It's not about worldly things. It's about spiritual things. And so what do you see some of the qualities that he had? Well, again, you think about the way he interacted with Pharaoh. I don't want to say he wasn't respectful of Pharaoh. He was. And as Christians, that's one of the principles that the Bible teaches us. One of the qualities that we should have is we should be respectful of worldly authority. We should be respectful of those in power here upon this earth. And Paul tells us why in Romans 13, 1 and 2. I'm going to read from, this is a version I mentioned a couple weeks ago, God's Word. I may throw one of these in here every once in a while, just kind of give you a different perspective. But think about the way that is written here and the idea of Christians being respectful of worldly authority. Paul says every person should obey the government in power. No government would exist if it hadn't been established by God. The governments which exist have been put in place by God. Therefore, whoever resists the government opposes what God has established. Those who resist will bring punishment on themselves. We understand that as Christians, right? We understand that we respect world leaders, those in authority. It's not because we view them as the most valuable thing here upon this earth. It has to do with the idea of supreme authority. It has to do that we respect these people because God established government. And because we respect supreme authority, divine authority, we recognize this as an extension of God's authority here upon this earth. And so as Christians, we should have a respectful attitude, a special attitude toward those in authority. We have to see them as being delegated or appointed by God. And so we pay heed to them because of the greater view of authority that we have. Do we see human authority as the most significant? No, that's not at all the case. But we do honor and respect it because it's something that has come from God. Remember Jesus when he appeared before Pilate in John chapter 19, verses 9 through 11? I've always found that interaction interesting. I wish I had a little bit more time to talk about it and break it down. But he takes Jesus into the judgment hall and he asks him, he says, where have you come from? Remember, Jesus wouldn't say anything. And so in verse 10, Pilate, he asked him the question. He says, are you not speaking to me? Are you not going to tell me anything? Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you? He said, don't you know that I have the authority to release you? I can either put you to death or I can turn you free. You're not going to talk to me? And do you remember what Jesus said to him in verse 11? He said, thou couldst have no power at all against me except it were given thee from above. You understand what he's saying? Was Jesus in awe of Pilate when he stood before him? Was he not speaking because he was so full of admiration of Pilate and the great position that he held? No, that wasn't the case at all. And when you look at Jacob, Jacob wasn't overly impressed by Pharaoh. Did he respect him? Yeah. But he wasn't overly impressed by him. He didn't feel that he had to, portray himself to Pharaoh as being some great man, or he needed to impress him in any way. And that's because pilgrims desire the applause of God more than the applause of man. We pay respect to human authority because it pleases supreme authority. And so the quality that a pilgrim displays here is the correct view of people. The second point, sub-point under this is, another quality a pilgrim displays is concern for others. I want you to look at verse 29 with me. It says, that the time drew nigh that Israel must die. And he called his son Joseph and said unto him, if now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. But I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. Notice verse 31. Jacob says, swear unto me. There's some important points to this conversation that need to be made. First of all, Jacob goes into Egypt. He gets to live there 17 more years. But he knows he's not eternal. He knows that his day is coming. He knows he's going to die. And so here he comes, and he knows that it's approaching, and he comes and he asks Joseph. He makes Joseph promise something. He makes him swear in it. And if you'll read the rest of the story toward the end of the book, he makes all of his sons do the same thing. That oath was that they would not leave his bones in Egypt. That one day they would take his bones and they would carry them over into the land of Canaan, and they would bury him there. Now I want you to stop and think about that. And I know, you can read all kinds of commentators, and they'll say, well, it was important to those people that they were buried with their ancestors, and it was. But why did Jacob want them to take his bones and to go into the land of Canaan and to bury them there? And I think the answer is this. He knew they weren't going to stay there forever. And here they are, they've just entered into this place, and man, it's good. You got the land of Goshen, you got all these opportunities, you got Joseph in power. But one day, God was planning for them to leave this land. And so he tells them, he says, I want you guys to promise me one day you'll get out of Egypt. You'll take my bones back to the land of Canaan, and you'll bury them there. And so I think that promise was to motivate them, to give them the opportunity to leave. He wanted, his concern was not for himself. Listen, Jacob lived his life. He knew where he was going. He wasn't concerned about that. But he was concerned about the next generation. And he was concerned about them fulfilling the will of God and inheriting the promises of God. He knew that God had promised that he would make them a great nation. He knew that God had promised them a great land. He knew that God had promised them that through their seed, or through their descendants, a seed would come who would bless all nations of the earth. And so his concern was not for himself. Do you think it really made him? Well, think about this. I don't know. Maybe I have a different perspective on death. Listen, I've told my wife before, I don't care what you do with my bones when I die. I mean, you can put them in a pine box and stick them under the back porch for all I care. That's not going to be my concern when I'm dying. So where's my bones going to be? Jacob didn't care one bit where his bones were going to be buried. That had no bearing on his eternity. But what and who he was thinking about was the next generation. And he wanted those people to be able to be blessed by God. He wanted them to be fulfilling the will of God here upon this earth. And so the quality of a pilgrim, we don't just think about ourselves, but we're concerned with others. That brief encounter that Jacob has with Pharaoh is a very interesting one indeed, because through it, we see the mentality that a pilgrim develops. That mentality is that earthly life is just a visit. It's just a temporary stop that we're making in the greater view of our lives through eternity. It also teaches us that what's important is not the temporary, but the eternal. That's the mentality that the pilgrim life has. The difficulties that a pilgrim life will encounter. Some things are going to be beyond our control in this life. Some things are going to be self-inflicted. But some things are just going to be the product of living in a physical world and being surrounded by sinful and wicked people. And we just have to understand that these things are going to happen. And when they do, we just have to grit down, grit our teeth and make it through it. And so carry their will here out upon this life, because God's will here in this life, because this is not the best part of living. The best is yet to come. And then we learn about the quality that a pilgrim displays. A pilgrim has to have the correct view of people. It's not a physical worldview, but it's a spiritual. Jacob understood that spiritually speaking, he was of value in the eyes of God. And so I don't have to be president of the United States. I don't have to be a world leader in order to have value in the sight of God or to value the souls of other people. And then the last thing is the correct view or the concern for others. Not just, when we get to the end of our life as Christians, appreciate what Brother Dennis said in class today, we know where we're going. I mean, there should be no doubt in our mind. And we're not going to be worried about where our bones are going to be buried or anything like that. The only thing, I'll guarantee you, the only thing we're going to be thinking about is the next generation. God's will being carried here out on the earth, other people inheriting the promises of God. The lesson is yours.